Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together, with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. Joining us this week is Frederick Kagan, longtime AEI scholar who leads our Critical Threats Project, which is a collection of analysts and young people and smart people and PhDs, and Fred himself in partnership with his wife Kim at the Institute for the Study of War that focuses on the hotspots around the world and really is the primary source for what's happening in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in the Far East. And right now, the hottest spot in the world is Ukraine. There's a war going on in Europe here in the 21st century. And it's kind of tragic and sad and difficult. And I think it's important that we remember that we're at war, that there's a war in Europe, and people are dying every day to either subjugate Ukraine from the Russian side or to preserve Ukraine's independence and freedom from the Ukrainian side. That is the way you see it, Fred. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is the largest war on the European continent since World War II. It was an unprovoked, illegal Russian war of conquest. It's also a genocidal war. The Russian project is explicitly the elimination of the Ukrainian identity, nationhood, ethnicity, culture, as well as statehood. And there are huge stakes for the United States in this. It's very easy to frame this as, we're helping the Ukrainian people defend themselves. And of course, we are and we should, and I believe in that. But we're also helping the Ukrainians fight for us, because this is a Russia that has set itself the project of destroying American leadership in the world and replacing the world order that benefits us so well with an autocratic world order that is a kind of a law of the jungle, in which American values and interests and pocketbooks would be very badly injured, and the Ukrainians are at the forefront of that fight.
And the news this week, and this is coming out soon after this occurred, was the introduction of North Korean soldiers into the area. And I wondered how you see that. What does that mean? Is that a major turning point?
Well, it's very significant. I'm a Russian historian, and so one of the things I've been doing has been racking my brain to think if I could think of another time when a Russian ruler has brought foreign troops onto Russian soil to drive off foreign troops. And I can't offhand think of an example. So this is a rather unprecedented thing that Putin is doing. On the one hand, it says all kinds of things about Putin's calculations and Russia's limitations and weaknesses, that he needs to do this. On the other hand, of course, it is a problem for Ukraine. We'll see how large a problem it is depending on the one hand, how well these North Korean troops actually perform, and on the other hand, whether there are more North Korean troops coming behind behind these.
So let's set the table for the battle, or the war as it stands. How many soldiers under arms does the Russians have in the area?
So the Russians, I don't have the exact numbers, but the Russians have on the close order of 650,000 troops all involved in the Ukraine war, I think. I'm going to say don't quote me on that. People will. I don't have the number at my fingertips.
But it's in the 600, 500 to 700
Yeah,
range.
It's well over 500,000 troops that the Russians have engaged in this effort.
And the Ukrainians?
The Ukrainians, I think, have something like 1 million men and women under arms, all in. But again, I can't tell you what proportion of those are on the battlefield and so on.
Oh, well, that actually surprised me because Russia is a much bigger country and has many more people. And you're saying that, if we were writing a Rick Atkinson book and he was talking about the number of soldiers brought to the battle, or a Civil War book, they would say that there were more. The general on the Ukrainian side has more men under arms than the general on the Russian side.
I've given you an apples to oranges comparison. I think that's about the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russian armed forces, all in, are much larger than
yes,
that. Yeah. But the Russians, in terms of the forces that the Russians have actually dedicated to fighting in Ukraine, it's something on upwards of 500,000. And there are a lot of Russian troops all over Russia, of course, that are
yes,
not,
and I completely understand that. But you can't a Russian soldier out by Japan is not having an influence on the war.
Some of them do, some of them don't. I mean, soldiers sitting with a rifle in Japan, they're fortunate not in Japan, but
yes.
near Japan is not doing that. But it's it's complicated.
Okay, but let's just talk about this for a second, because on the other hand, on the Ukrainian side, a million men and women under arms, they're all fairly close to the border, to the battle.
They are, but the Ukrainians have obviously a number of challenges. First of all, that would be the entire Ukrainian military, and a lot of those people can't be fighting either. That there's a lot of stuff that has to go on in the rear. But in addition to that, and this is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians conducted the Kursk operation in the first place, the Ukrainians have to defend their entire common border with Russia and Belarus. And that means that they've had to keep reserves who are not actually fighting to defend against the kinds of cross-border incursions that the Russians did in Kharkiv earlier on, and that they were preparing to conduct, the Ukrainians report, into Sumy Oblast.
So even in Ukraine, the battle is not all on the divide
Correct.
Between the red and the blue.
Not all of the troops are on the front line, right?
Okay, but let's now talk about those troops. Again, I'm really interested in sort of, are they encamped? Are they in ditches? Are they? What are the soldiers on either side of the line that you guys draw on your map? What are they doing?
On the front line,
on the active front line.
So yes, they're all under cover, because if you're not under cover, then you're getting killed. So they're in trenches or field fortifications or buildings or other things like that, as a general rule. Both sides have learned not to concentrate a lot of forces or vehicles in a single place. The Russians blow this periodically, and the Ukrainians kill a lot of them. But in general terms, they've done that.
So they're spread out.
And they're all generally in some kind of cover, either trenches or fortifications or something else like that.
On a daily basis, do they come out of their cover and load a artillery device and shoot it?
There's constant fighting all along the front line.
And that shooting is in the form of?
It's in the form of Russians or Ukrainians, but more often Russians, getting up out of their trenches and either walking or driving toward Ukrainian defensive positions, coming under rifle fire, coming under mortar fire, coming under artillery fire, and of course coming heavily under drone attack, which has become very dominant. Sometimes the Russians will use armored vehicles to try to support those operations. Ukrainians will fire back with all kinds of things. There's massive artillery barrages that are going on. It's like it's a war.
Yeah.
If you picture a war, that's what it looks like.
Okay, but it also doesn't sound too much different from the battle for North Africa in 1943. It's soldiers and units going up against each other in armored attack.
Yeah, it is a conventional war. It has different characteristics because of the technology of the time, and because it doesn't look like North Africa, because what neither side has been able to do since the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv and Kherson in 2022, neither side has been able to conduct mechanized maneuver. And so that's why we've seen these very gradual movements of the front line that are more reminiscent of World War I kind of movement in terms of how far the line moves on any given day, even though they've got armored vehicles and a whole bunch of other stuff.
So mechanized maneuver, I think you're talking about tanks.
It's tanks and armored personnel carriers, right,
and
driving rapidly across country.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the reason they can't use them is because they're easy targets?
Yeah,
on both sides.
They can't keep them alive. That's right.
So I don't know what the most sophisticated tank the Ukrainians have is, but
M1s.
It's an M1, and
Yeah.
I've seen an M1. My son has worked with M1s. are you saying to me that if a well-trained team of Ukrainian soldiers get in their M1 and drive it toward that border, there's a device coming from the Russian side that can knock them out?
The Russians have a bunch of things that they can kill it with. You can kill a tank with a drone, because tanks are designed to fight other tanks. And so the armor is not evenly spread across the body of the tank. And the top of the tank is the most vulnerable part. And unfortunately, for both sides, drones fly in the air. And so they conduct top attacks on the weakest points of the tank. And this is how the Ukrainians are regularly killing Russian tanks. The Russians are doing the same to Ukrainian tanks. But there are also anti-tank guided missiles that can kill them. And if you land an artillery round on any tank in the world, you will blow it to smithereens. Doesn't matter what kind of tank it is.
Really? So the artillery can knock it out too?
100%. Wow. Always has been able to.
And the drone can just come over it and shoot something down into the weakest part? And
yeah. Most commonly, the Ukrainians are dropping anti-tank, basically the stuff, the anti-tank rounds that you would fire out of anti-tank guided missiles. You can just drop those and they'll detonate and penetrate through the top armor. This is where it's been a big meme about the Russian turrets popping off of their tanks.
Mm-hmm.
That's because of bad design. And the reason that happens is because the Russians store the ammunition for the tank main guns in the turret of the tank. So if you penetrate and get any kind of fire into the turret, all those rounds cook off. The M1 doesn't do that.
Okay.
It's harder to kill an M1.
So mechanized warfare, that's the term you used, is not really in play here on this line of battle.
Mechanized maneuver.
Mechanized maneuver is not in play. So Rommel versus Montgomery is not happening, or Patton.
Right.
That's not. It really is back to World War I, another generation back. It's a bunch of infantrymen and artillery devices faced off against each other.
Well, there's armored vehicles on both sides, but they're not able to concentrate, and they're not able to do what you saw in World War II, where you would penetrate, you would have a bunch of tanks and armored personnel carriers penetrate a defensive line and then drive fast into the rear. They can't do that now because they take prohibitive losses trying to make the penetration, and then they continue to take a lot of losses as they try to exploit that penetration, and you're not able to get enough vehicles through to do that.
Okay. So I think we heard a month or two ago that an estimate, I think you guys endorse, but if not, let me know, that the number of Russian casualties in the war is 600,000 as well, something along those lines.
Well, we can't do it independently, but that sounds about right.
You know, back in the Vietnam War, there was this thing called the body count.
Yeah.
And I know that it's a debilitating statistic and it takes your gut out, but what is the body count on a daily or weekly basis right now?
So I guess it's averaging probably on the Russian side about 1,000 a day.
1,000 a day.
Because what we know is that the Russians aim to recruit about 30,000 a month, and the Russian recruitment rate has been able to keep Russian forces at about the same strength over the course of these offensive operations. So it's doing the finger math and coming with an average of something like 1,000 a day.
So that's a statistic you don't hear.
That's on the Russian side.
I got it.
It's much lower on the Ukrainian side.
I know that. I'm going to come to the Ukrainian side in a minute, but again, if you read the newspapers every day and you listen to the media and you listen to certain candidates for president, you would think that Ukraine is losing the war, and the Russians are just pushing it. But 1,000 casualties a day for the Russian army is no small thing. And from a perspective of the Ukrainian cause, it's a significant accomplishment.
It is.
And how are they doing that?
Well, they're doing it with all of the weapon systems and a lot of innovation. And this is one of the key advantages the Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians are more innovative, and they're able to adapt and innovate more rapidly. And so they have been really leading the way on drones. The Russians use a lot of drones as well. The Ukrainians do it better. And the characteristic of this battlefield is that's most interesting in modern times. Wars have a sound, and one of the sounds of this war is the buzz of drones. Because at any given time, there can be thousands of drones over a given battlefield.
Thousands?
Yeah.
And the drone all of us have in our head is about the size of a bread basket.
Yep.
And we could hold it in our hands and,
Yep.
hold it over our head. Is that the size of these drones?
A lot of them, yeah.
And they're armored with armor that is sufficiently strong to take out a tank?
No, the drones that take out the tanks are bigger.
Okay.
You got to kind of stretch your hands out about like this.
Okay. He's putting his arms out like,
about
Jesus
about,
Christ on the
about,
cross.
About a wide.
Okay.
I wouldn't have gone with that analogy, but okay. They're the big quadcopters or hexcopters, and they're still relatively small compared to most
And they
weapons.
have a weapon in them.
And it's a standard anti-tank round that you would fire out of an anti-tank guided missile. Or
so what's the
RPG.
size of the pellet?
So what you need to know is that those large quadcopters carry payloads of maybe 16, 20 kilograms. And you can carry a few of the rounds that you would use in an anti-tank.
And that's all you need to go get one tank.
If you can put it, this is the thing, if you can put it precisely where it needs to be.
And then fire.
No. If you can put the round precisely on the most vulnerable point of the tank, you can kill the tank. Let me tell you a story.
Yeah.
One of these little first-person view drones that are of the small, you can hold it in your hand kind. There's a video going around of one of these things killing a Russian tank. I thought I had assessed that was not possible until I saw the video. How did they do it? They had a very small charge, armored penetrating charge, far too small to penetrate the armor of a tank. But the Ukrainian operator brought this drone and put that charge right up against the turret ring, which is the thinnest and most vulnerable part of the tank, and then detonated it.
It's sort of like a safe blower, a blower of a safe.
Exactly
they put it right up against.
You put it right on the vulnerable spot, and then it takes a very small explosive. And because of the bad Russian tank design, I mean, that would have been bad news for any tank, but because of the bad Russian tank, Kip cooks off all of the rounds inside the turret, and then everybody's dead catastrophically.
So, and then the one last thing, again, I'm not sure I completely understood this, is each one of these drones is not operating, well, maybe it is, but is operating under the control of a remote human who's guiding it pushing the shoot button.
That's right.
They're not automatic. They're not operating on their own, finding their target and hitting.
They're not yet autonomous, although we're starting to see that.
Okay.
We're starting to see that.
So this drone technology is playing a large role in this war. It's putting a lot of damage on the Russian side, less so damage on the Ukrainian side.
Yes, although the Russians have these and use them also, and they kill a lot of Ukrainians and Ukrainian vehicles with these.
Okay. And again, you said 1,000 casualties a day on the Russian side. What do you think it is on the Ukrainian side?
Robert, by policy, we don't estimate that. So
you don't? Okay.
No, we don't.
All right.
It's high. I don't want to conceal that, but I don't know what it is.
Okay. It's a war.
It's a war.
It's a serious war. And so, okay. Now, the line has been fairly static for a pretty long time.
Yep.
How can that line, you're a strategist, how can that line move east?
Yeah. So Kim and I wrote a long paper about this earlier this year, laying out what we thought needed to happen in order for the Ukrainians to be able to restore maneuver to the battlefield. And it's a lot of stuff that the Ukrainians can do. It was less focused on what I suspect you would like to talk about, because there's a straightforward answer to this, which is, well, we could give the Ukrainians what they need in order to do that. That would be a great place to start.
But what is that if we gave it to them, they could do it? What is it?
Well, start with all of the material of modern warfare. So give me just a second to explain a particular problem here.
Okay.
So we're all talking about Ukrainian manpower deficiencies, and it's very real. The Ukrainians have serious manpower deficiencies. So the Ukrainians passed a law earlier this year to lower the enlistment, the conscription age, and they brought in 75 or 100,000 more soldiers to their army. They aren't able to use them all because they aren't able to equip them all, because they don't have the rifles, they don't have the tanks, they don't have the armored personnel carriers or anything to give them. And that is because we have had them on a starvation diet of the material of war. So as the Americans are talking about how the Ukrainians need to step up and deal with their manpower deficiency.
Well, no. I want to be clear. I'm not
No,
saying
no,
that.
no. I didn't
I'm not
suggest you
saying
are,
that.
but this is a major trope. And the thing that is problematic about this is that we don't collectively accept our own agency in contributing to the problem that the Ukrainians are having. They can mobilize 1 million men and women, but if you can't actually arm them, then they're not soldiers.
Okay, but I'm going to come back to that. That's a point that I want to pursue a little bit. But before I do that, leaving out if they had it, what would they do? What would be the strategy,
right,
and how would it be applied on the battlefield?
Yeah. So, look, there are a bunch of problems that the Ukrainians have to deal with in order to restore maneuver to the battlefield. One is they have to deal with the Russian drones. They have to deal with Russian electronic warfare systems. This war is the most advanced war we've ever seen from the standpoint of electronic warfare. And that's one of the key things the Russians use to interfere with the Ukrainian drones. They have to deal with Russian air defense systems. And they have to be able to suppress all of these things in order to be able to keep a mass of vehicles and people moving fast enough to make a penetration.
Okay, I see. So in other words, there's a lot of battlefield preparation and defensive air defense apparatus that's needed in order to protect the advancing army. But if they had that, they could concentrate and advance.
Well, they also need to be able to suppress all of that stuff on the Russian side.
That's what I meant.
Yeah,
if they could suppress the other.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so that's an issue. And then what about this? Okay, so in the absence of that, because they clearly don't have that,
Right.
you said that they don't have that, and we'll come back to that. They have been, what it looks to me like they've adopted kind of a revolutionary American war strategy or maybe even the strategy the Afghanistan threw the Russians out when they invaded back in the Jimmy Carter administration, a kind of pesky make the Russians feel pain with attacks that are beyond the line, that are in Crimea or even into Russia.
Oh.
And is that a strategy that they're adopting? Are these drone attacks that they're sending into Russia having an effect?
Yes, it's not the kind of thing that you're talking about. It's actually a much more coherent part of a conventional warfare strategy that they're engaged in.
Okay.
Those attacks are having a big effect. So one of the disadvantages the Ukrainians operate under is the Russians have had enormous superiority in artillery. And the Ukrainians, earlier in the year, after we'd cut them off and weren't providing them any more aid, had reported artillery ratios of 1-8. So that the Russians had fired 8 rounds for every round the Ukrainians fired. That's a really no good place to be in if you're a Ukrainian soldier. More recently, the Ukrainians have reported that, at least in important areas of the front, the ratios dropped to 1-2. That isn't because we flooded Ukraine with artillery. Finally, stuff we should have been giving them finally got there, but more to the point, a couple of these drone attacks hit massive Russian ammunition stores and blew up probably hundreds of thousands of rounds of Russian artillery. And that has hurt the Russians very badly and in a very visible way on the front line. Now, some of the other strikes that the Ukrainians have been doing have been hitting Russian air defenses. And that's a big part of what they've been doing in Crimea. They've also, of course, it's one of the few instances anyway when a country with no navy has actually won major naval battles. They've sunk a third of the Black Sea fleet, and they've pushed the rest of it into the eastern Black Sea, which is important because the Russians were using that to fire missiles and other things at them. So the strikes have been about doing that.
Okay. And you mentioned in a report, I think, from yesterday or maybe today, that they hit a distillery?
Yes.
What is a distillery?
Well, it produces alcohol.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of jokes that you can make because, I mean, you can make an argument that if they would just destroy the Russia vodka industry, it probably could end the war pretty quickly.
Okay.
But actually, this is a war material distillery. And it's going to be interesting to see because one of the things that you use alcohol for is de-icing aircraft. And if the Ukrainians if, and I don't know if this is true, if the Ukrainians can put a dent in the de-icing fluid that the Russians have available, that could affect Russian aircraft operational readiness rates over the course of the winter because, it gets kind of cold there, especially in a lot of places the Russians are flying from. So that was what that was for.
Okay, so now you made the point, a pretty strong point, a pretty critical point of, and I think you used the us and the we in your point. That is a kind of a contradiction of what you hear from the Republican candidate for president, which is that we haven't done enough and we've cut them off, and whatever we're doing is not anywhere near sufficient and is almost shameful. The other side, as I say, feels we've done way too much and says it all the time, and that we've, what is President Trump's line is Zelensky's the best salesman he's ever met. And we certainly have given hundreds of millions of dollars.
We've given many billions of dollars.
Many billions of dollars. Yeah. Okay, and the Europeans have done something there, so they have gotten stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a war, and it's exhausted. It gets spent.
Yep.
And so, one idea that I've heard an AI scholar suggest that is that we take all of the kit, all of the armor, all of the shells that are deployed, in a major.
Yeah.
I don't know if the term is battalion or division.
The brigade sets.
A brigade, and just transfer it to them and let them use that. What's your take on that?
So I think what that's referring to is we have sets of equipment for armored or mechanized brigades pre-positioned in Europe.
Yes.
In case we need to fight Russia.
Which is what we're doing.
Yeah, it's very much maybe one will come up.
Yes.
And so I think that it would make a lot of sense to let the Ukrainians use that to defeat the Russians.
Since we are fighting the Russians
they are fighting the Russians on our behalf.
Yes.
And rather than actually putting ourselves in a position where we will have to use that stuff ourselves, I think that argument makes a lot of sense.
Does that require congressional authorization?
Only in the sense that if we're transferring anything, it requires congressional authorization. Okay. But I'm not an expert on this, but I think we could do that under the authorities that we would have. I'm not sure.
Okay. So
I know the administration is not asked to do that.
Right. So the war goes on, and you feel that in order for the Ukrainians to be successful, that it would be helpful if they had more equipment and armor and more authorization to use it. Do you see any sign? Your daily reports do report on the sort of the mood in Russia. You do a lot of reporting, I read, on the political environment around Putin. So I feel like you're the best source I have, not just for the status of the battlefield, but also for what's happening around Putin. Do you see any sign of weakness or flailing or flagging on the Russian side that would make them back off?
No. I see problems that are coming down the pike for Putin in 2025 that are going to force him to make some decisions that he's going to find very unpleasant. But we just published the results of recent polling. Support remains high. It's a war. You still see that phenomenon. And the people around Putin are dependent on Putin. They were never oligarchs, by the way. It's a mistake to refer to them as oligarchs because it's not an oligarchy; it's an autocracy.
Mm-hmm.
So no one's turning on him and like that. But he's going to face some very unpleasant and difficult decisions in 2025, and he's going to have a lot of problems. Look, I think it's important that your listeners understand that the overarching narrative here is very doom and gloom, and is very the Ukrainians are losing. And the Ukrainians can't hold, and the Russians are going to steamroller them, and that's the way this is going to go.
Well, I'm not associating myself with that.
I never suggested you were.
Yeah, I got it, but there's a concern that is a possibility.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say I know that, and I see the Russians have been making gains every day. The significance of these gains is being magnified out of proportion to how much they really matter. But the Russians are making gains, and it's important to acknowledge the Ukrainians are in a bad spot. What I think is getting really lost in the discussion is that the Russians also have very serious problems and very serious limitations. There has been a long-standing Russian information operation that has unfortunately been very effective. That is, Russia is basically the Soviet Union, and the Russian army is basically the Red Army, and they're going to steamroller the Ukrainians the way they steamroller the Germans, and it's hopeless. And that is not true. None of those statements are true.
Well, it's been proven to be not true because that's what we all thought, what we all were told when they came across the border back in February of 22.
Right.
And the Russians were beat back. And there's no question that there's a tremendous amount of evidence that Russia's in trouble and has problems.
Right.
They've lost 600,000 casualties.
Right.
So Ukraine has done a good job of smacking the Russians around. There's no question about that. So I think I will challenge you a little bit on that, Fred. I think the jury's out.
No. I'm not giving you my view. I'm just saying, as we're looking at the Western information space and what everybody's saying.
Yeah.
This has become the dominant narrative,
despite
all of
your best efforts.
Despite our best efforts,
even though you're calling them as we see them.
We are, but look. We call balls and strikes, as long ago you asked us to. That's what we do. And the Ukrainians have made a lot of outs. I mean, there's been a lot of bad things going on for the Ukrainians. And we don't sugarcoat that.
Yes.
And this is something we want to focus on more and more. And, of course, this has been a terrible year for Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it's been a terrible year in no small part because we cut them off. And that has slipped out of our narrative entirely.
Well, Fred, not a lot of people say we cut them off. I that's really shock. I mean, that really is, to me, is news on this broadcast, because really you would say that the United States of America in the last days of the Biden administration cut Ukraine off?
No, I would say that the United States of America, when it failed to pass the aid bill that was finally passed in April of this year for 6 months, led to the trickling and near stopping of the flow of U.S. assistance to Ukraine.
Okay, so let's just tell that history lesson. What you just said was that when there was the 6-month delay in the aid bill, which was Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, and it was delayed because the House of Representatives would not act, and frankly, former President Trump would not authorize them to act or support their acting, and there was a lot of effort to sort of get that passed. That 6-month delay was very damaging.
It was devastating.
And yet, ultimately, it did pass.
Yep.
And the aid has flown. I saw this past week, Biden approved another package of aid. So the aid is flowing. Equipment is going into Ukraine now. But you're going back, and in the history of this, you'll say that 6-month delay may have been the turning point?
No, because I think that we can turn it around again. But it was an inflection point in the war. Because, first of all, look, there's a lot
And just to be clear, Fred, just to be clear about the history of this. During that 6-month period, President Biden's administration was asking for this aid. Senator McConnell in the Republican Senate was supporting that aid. The holdup in that aid was the House of Representatives and Donald Trump. That is a fact.
Yes. That fact being so, the Biden administration did not act as swiftly as it could have after the aid was passed, after the bill was passed, to get the aid to Ukraine in a timely fashion, and instead has doled it out in a more piecemeal way that has made it so that instead of a deteriorating situation which suddenly got better, there was a deteriorating situation which continued to deteriorate and then began slowly to pick up. So there is bipartisan blame here, Robert, and I think it's important to recognize that.
So when I was in Europe with a bunch of AEI scholars, there was a lot of discussion of the fact that these sanctions have not worked as successfully in making the Russians suffer. Where are you on that?
If your expectation was that the sanctions would cause Putin to stop this war, then they have not been successful, but then you were always living in a fantasy world.
Well, the 2 points that were made was that, A, we've passed the sanctions, but they are violated. by European players who allow goods and technology to flow anyway, or Asian players. And then the second is that a key ingredient to the sanctions is the freezing of the money.
Right.
It's been frozen but not seized.
Correct.
What about that? Where are you on that?
It should be seized.
Okay.
I agree with that.
I think the Biden administration is pushing for that.
They have been, and they've been in a good place on this, and the Euros are dragging their feet on this, and I think that's a problem. Look, on the effectiveness of the sanctions, yes, the sanctions are being violated, and we need to tighten up our enforcement of the sanctions. Let me tell you a good thing about the sanctions. So I've given you Russian infantry losses or personnel losses. Russian tank losses, I don't have the most recent figures, but Russian tank losses as of several months ago had been averaging about 150 a month. That's pretty remarkable, by the way, because there are about 100 tanks in a tank brigade.
It's very remarkable.
So it's a lot of tanks. And the Russians have been producing about that number of tanks. But the number I'm about to give you is probably about six months old, because they're not producing as many tanks anymore, I don't think. The Russians have been producing about 150 tanks a month, of which only about 25 or 30 were new production. The rest were refurbished Soviet tanks. And you're starting to see some real museum artifacts on the battlefield on the Russian side. The T-54 tanks turning up on the battlefield, make old Cold Warriors nostalgic. And the reason for that is in part sanctions, because the T-90 tanks and the Armata tanks require Western stuff. They can't get it at scale. And so they can't scale up production of systems that depend on Western equipment. And they haven't been able to offset that supply chain on their own. So the sanctions are having a real meaningful and impactful effect on the conduct of the war that really mustn't be underestimated, even as we rightly criticize those who are not enforcing them as they should and who are not expanding them as they should.
Okay. All right, so this is the last point we want to talk about, and that's the broad historical context. Okay. You are a historian in your first discipline. I am not an historian, but I look at it from a 100-year perspective, or even more personally, a 63-year perspective. I was born in 1961, and that was when President Kennedy called us to a long twilight struggle against the Soviet Union and the autocrats of the time. And there was a wall across Eastern Europe where multiple countries were enslaved by the Russians, including all of Poland, all of East Germany, all of Czechoslovakia. And, of course, Ukraine was part of Russia.
Yeah. So it was part of the Soviet Union.
It was part of the Soviet Union. Okay, you're right. But since then, and a lot of people, I can remember when I first came to Washington to work as a young person after college, there was this discussion about the distinction between rollback and containment.
Yeah.
And very, very smart people who went to your university, Yale University, said to me, oh, there's no hope for rollback. There's only containment. Right. And
that's why you shouldn't listen to Yale.
There you go. But look what happened. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. All of those nations, including the Baltic nations in the north, which I've never had any real hope for, became independent countries. And then Ukraine became an independent country. And now in a sort of rearguard action, desperate action of a man who refuses to acknowledge that he's on the wrong side of history, we're fighting over Ukraine, but all the rest of Europe is of that part of Europe is free and independent. Can we look at this in that context? That this is, we're suffering some setbacks, but yet if you look at it from the broader context, we've won.
No.
Why not?
Because we are not. We Americans have not internalized exactly what the stakes of this struggle are. It is not a foregone conclusion that Ukraine will survive. It's a war. And you don't know what the outcome of war is until it's over. And if we cut Ukraine off, and if the Russians are able to bring in the assistance, and I see where you're going with this,
yes.
And if they're able to mobilize the global partnerships with other autocrats that they're working on, it's not inconceivable that they could conquer Ukraine. Now, if they conquer Ukraine, they will acquire a huge boost of resources, innovation, capability, military technology, the second largest and the most effective military in Europe. And the game of reconquest of the Russian Empire will be on. Now, will we ultimately win? I hope and trust that we will. But if we allow that to happen, then the enormous gains that you're describing that we secured in the 1980s under the leadership of Ronald Reagan and George Bush will be lost. And we will have to, at best, fight for them all over again. So no, we haven't. History doesn't end, as you know. And Putin is doing his best to bring that history back. This is the place to stop him. This is why Ukraine is so important for Americans.
So what you're really saying is that we're in a new kind of twilight struggle, and with a slightly different adversary. And this brings up Mr. Eberstadt's column in the Washington Post, our colleague Nick Eberstadt, where he linked the Ukraine battle to the war in the Middle East, to the conflict with China in Asia, and with North Korea. And he wrote, "We must look at the threats we face on a world island today with new, more strategically sophisticated lenses. We must come to understand that for all intents and purpose, the war in Gaza and Lebanon against Israel by Iranian proxies is the war by Russia against Ukraine, as would be the war in Taiwan that China may unleash at a time of Beijing's own choosing. All one." Do you agree with that?
I do.
Okay. Well, the stakes are high.
The stakes are very high.
And we are living in a time of great peril.
Indeed.
And AEI is very grateful. The country is very grateful that you're helping us think these things through. Thanks a lot, Fred.
Thank you so much, Robert.
See you next time.